In August 1991, the Soviet Union stood at a crossroads. Reform, collapse, or control, no one knew what would happen. On August 19th, a group of hardline leaders attempted to seize power while President Mikhail Gorbachev was away. For 3 days, tanks rolled, phones crackled with rumors, and millions held their breath. Gorbachev, the architect of perestroika and glasnost, was at his dacha in Crimea. Cut lines blocked roads, a ring of loyal but isolated guards. The president was effectively under house arrest. Envoys demanded he sign a decree proclaiming a state of emergency. He refused. To the public, the plotters announced he was ill, an obvious fiction in an era already growing skeptical of official truth. Morning in Moscow arrived to the rattle of armored tracks on asphalt. Columns of tanks and personnel carriers entered the city, their barrels elevated like mute exclamation points. A new body, the State Committee on the State of Emergency, declared authority with Vice President Gennady Yanev as its face. He appeared on television, hands trembling as he read from a sheet of paper. The image of power wavered before it could harden. In apartment blocks and offices, people rushed to radios and TVs. Whispers moved faster than tanks. Is Gorbachev gone? Will there be shooting? Will the borders close? Some feared 1968 all over again. Crackdowns, arrests, a long freeze of history. But others had lived through years of shortages, censorship, and silence. They were ready to speak with their feet. Crowds formed around the Russian White House, the parliament of the Russian Republic. Inside, Boris Yeltsin convened deputies and staff, gathering a shaky but determined resistance. He walked outside, climbed atop a tank, and spoke into a handheld microphone. He denounced the coup as unconstitutional, called for a general strike, and urged soldiers not to obey illegal orders. The image of a civilian on a tank became a mirror for the country. One by one, Muscovites brought lumber, barrels, and fencing to build barricades. Bus drivers parked their vehicles as makeshift shields. Students dragged coils of wire to slow armored vehicles. Priests offered blessings. Actors and musicians brought food and songs. Doctors carried first aid kits. Night thickened, but the city did not sleep. Bonfires burned in steel drums, casting orange light on faces streaked with summer dust. Some soldiers stepped down from their tanks to talk with the crowd. They passed cigarettes, shared tea, compared stories, and realized their orders pointed one way while their consciences tugged another. Not every moment was peaceful. Near an underpass, 3 young men were killed as armored vehicles tried to push through. Their deaths pierced the city's nerves and hardened its resolve. Candles appeared beside curbstones. Photographs were taped to concrete. Flowers, handwritten notes, a nation's grief in miniature. Meanwhile, the plotters held tense meetings, arguing over decrees and curfews. They prepared a press conference with shaky claims of necessity and order. Journalists asked blunt questions. The answers stumbled. The coup announced strength, but it projected doubt. Across the republics, leaders weighed their next moves. Baltic states reasserted their paths toward independence. In Kiev, in Tbilisi, in Almaty, people read events not as restoration, but as the last convulsion of an old system. Each hour, the coup failed to take complete control, its authority thinned. On August 20th, barricades grew higher and discipline steadier. Volunteers posted watch schedules, organized food lines, coordinated medical spots, and set up radios. Mothers brought tea, retirees brought maps, students brought courage, and off-duty workers brought tools. Simple acts of logistics became acts of citizenship. Some tank crews positioned their vehicles defensively, choosing not to advance. Others angled their turrets away from the crowds, an unspoken pact between uniform and civilian. Commanders called for decisive action, but received muddled compliance. Every hour without a clampdown multiplied the cost of attempting one. Internationally, cameras captured the uncertainty. Foreign leaders issued cautious statements. Markets jolted. Analysts counted divisions, brigades, loyalties like chess pieces on a board. Embassies checked evacuation plans. Hotlines warned. History edged forward on the tips of millions of shoes. By August 21st, momentum had shifted. Reports spread that units were withdrawing. Crowds parted to watch columns of armor depart the city they had tried to command. Cheering followed steel. Relief followed fear. Rain followed the heat of the standoff. Gorbachev was released from isolation and returned to Moscow. His plane descended over a capital that had defended an idea larger than any single man. He condemned the conspirators and resumed office, but the political balance had changed. Boris Yeltsin, the defiant figure on the tank, now stood taller in the public mind. The coup collapsed in 3 days, but those days compressed decades. Party structures fractured, censorship's mask slipped, loyalty oaths felt obsolete. Republic after republic accelerated toward independence. The union that had defined the 20th century in vast stretches of land and life began to unspool its speed. Funerals honored the dead. Barricades were dismantled plank by plank. Buses returned to their routes. Street sweepers erased chalked slogans one bucket at a time. Yet memory is not so easily tidied. Photographs of faces at barricades traveled the world. The image of a leader on a tank entered textbooks and living rooms alike. In December 1991, for months later, signatures ended the Soviet Union. Flags changed, borders hardened, currencies split. Factories adapted. Families migrated, archives opened, and secrets walked into daylight. The ground under politics had shifted, but the sidewalks where people stood their ground remained. What did those 3 days mean? They meant that power without consent is brittle. They meant that even tanks can hesitate when they see themselves reflected in the eyes of the people. The August coup failed because it could not command belief. It spoke the grammar of force to a public learning a new language of rights. It tried to rewind history while history was learning to sprint. In the end, a nation discovered that sometimes the most powerful word is no. Remember the trembling hands at the press table. Remember the volunteers warming tea at barricades. Remember the smoke from bonfires and the silence after the engine shut down. Remember the 3 who died and the thousands who stood. The story of those days is not just about the fall of a system. It is about the rise of citizens. It is about a city that discovered its voice in the echo of armored tracks. It is about people who learned in public that they could hold a line and history would bend around it. This is how the coup ended, not with a shot heard round the world, but with a refusal that spread through a crowd. Not with a decree, but with a chorus. Not with the certainty of power, but with the uncertainty of conscience, answered at last by courage. And so the crossroads became a turning. The empire became a memory, the future a question, and the people the authors of a new page.